All right, welcome in everybody. Tony Patelis here. This is the episode 2 of the brand new College Hoop News podcast. Tonight we're going to be doing an SEC preview. I have a special guest host. I'll introduce him in a second. We're going to be breaking down every team, what's going on in the conference. It's going to be a very exciting year in the SEC, very deep league, much improved league. So we'll get into all that tonight. Tonight, who's joining me is Blake Lovell. Blake runs southeasthoops.com. Does a great job covering college basketball, especially the SEC. And definitely check out his podcast, Marching to Madness. It's excellent. Always some great guests, a lot of great content. Blake, how are you tonight?
Tony, doing well, my man. We had a few technical issues here to start with, but I've relocated and we are good to go.
Okay. Well, let's get right into it. We're going to go in alphabetical order, guys. Alabama is the first team I wanted to talk about tonight, Blake. You know, this is obviously, probably the most excited we've ever seen Alabama fans regarding basketball. They bring in the best recruiting class in school history, Avery Johnson. He's really building a roster that I think can, compete at the top of the SEC. What are your thoughts on Alabama as a whole? And do you think they're going to handle these expectations well? Because, it's a lot different being, the top dog in the league.
Yeah, and that's the question you always have. I mean, when you have a team that's, has this kind of hype, and like you said, I mean, we're talking about a recruiting class that they haven't had like this before. They haven't had a Colin Sexton type of guy, a guy like that. You bring in John Petty, Alex Reese, Herb Jones, all these guys, and can they handle those expectations? And that's the question. That's probably something they've been focusing on a lot this offseason. I'd say Avery Johnson kind of working with them on that. Because, look, it's still kind of a young team when you think about it. I mean, you think about the young guys. You think about Braxton Key, who's only a sophomore. Dazon Ingram, only a sophomore, a redshirt sophomore. But still, you have guys that still kind of need that added experience. And so I think, to me, they have the talent. There's no doubt about it. They're not going to have those offensive lulls that they had last year because they have the playmakers now. But because of that, we know they're going to play defense well. I just want to see – when Alabama gets in those close games, can those guys kind of make the plays that maybe sometimes they couldn't last year? And to me, that's the biggest thing I'm looking for this year.
For sure. Last year, as you said, they struggled offensively big time. They're a good defensive team, but I think they plugged those holes, those offensive holes. John Petty, perimeter shooter, can really knock down threes. Colin Sexton can kind of do it all. One question I wanted to ask you, though, I wanted to key on Dazon Ingram a little bit. How does his role change, in your opinion, with Colin Sexton in the fold now?
Well, I think if anything, it helps him because, he had to handle the ball a lot last year. And I think with Ingram, the biggest thing, and Avery Johnson talked about this last year, he's talked about this offseason, is he's a very good shooter. He's a very good guy who can score. They know his natural ability is just to be able to score the ball. Well, now if he doesn't have to handle the ball as much, that's going to open him up for a lot more opportunities, to score. And, you think about just by adding a guy, we're going to talk about this with other teams tonight, but just by adding guys that are so good on offense, it automatically takes attention away from the guys who were so good last year that got all that attention, like Keith, like Ingram. Now I think of four instead of maybe two or three different guys. And so I think that really opens up for him. He's the guy, honestly, when you look at the entire roster, I'm most excited just to see how much he's improved because we know he had the injury this offseason, didn't get to play in Canada. But I'm looking forward to seeing him play. I think he has, all the potential in the world. And like I said, now that he has kind of those lanes opened up with a guy like Sexton coming in, Petty being able to shoot the way he can shoot, teams are going to have to kind of, play more to where they've got to guard all these guys instead of just a couple guys.
Yeah, there's a lot of weapons on this roster. Talking about the front court real quick, Dante Hall returns. He played solid last year. Then you bring in a guy like Daniel Giddens, 6'11", 240. What type of impact do you think Giddens has in this rotation?
Well, I think he just gives them more depth, and I think depth's going to be the key word we're going to talk about a lot this year. In that, if you have depth, you can compete in the SEC. This year, if you don't have depth, you can't compete because that's kind of what it's going to come down to. They now have two big bodies they can go to. I mean, I think Hall and Giddens will interchange in a lot of different scenarios. And Giddens is just a very strong type of guy. He's a guy who can be explosive, not only on the offensive end of the floor, he can help him on defense, obviously, with that size. Give him another guy in the paint that can kind of, clog things up. But I think those two, it's going to be interesting to see how they play, too, because we talked about it. I mean, you think about it, Sexton, Ingram, Petty, and Key. I mean, you're going to be able to play those 4 guys on the floor at the same time a lot, I would say. And so that's going to kind of leave one of those things where you can just kind of mix and match with who plays best and with a certain lineup. Is it Giddens? Is it Hall? But when they both are on the floor, I think that still is a big sort of advantage just because, they're bigger guys and they're going to have to be guys where not everybody's going to be able to go out on the perimeter and guard them. They're going to have to guard the guys on the inside as well.
Yeah, they seem to have a lot of depth, especially if these other freshmen can make impacts. Alex Reed, Herb Jones, like you mentioned earlier. And before we move on, I'm impressed. I like what they did with the non-conference schedule. It's really, really strong. BYU, Texas, Oklahoma, Minnesota. They even play Mercer, and I think they play UT Arlington as well.
Yep.
Talk about that a little bit, and Avery Johnson just really stacking that schedule.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I talked to him this offseason, and it's definitely by design. That's one of the things when you talk to all these guys that are expected to have, top 5, top 6 type of SEC teams. It's all by design. They want to make sure their team is tested because, look, I mean, that's what it comes down to. The improvement in the SEC this year, if you're not tested in the non-conference schedule, you're not going to be able to handle it once you get there. And so Alabama's playing these teams, like you mentioned, all these different teams. They have one of the stronger schedules just by looking at it. I mean, I think they have probably maybe top 3, top 4 schedule non-conference in the SEC, just on paper, of course. But there's a lot to like about it. I mean, games with Rhode Island, like we said, I mean, that's a team that a lot of people may just look at and say, well, it's Rhode Island. But no, they're the A-10, favorite. They're that good. And then you have all those other teams down the line as well. We know they're playing at Arizona. What's Arizona going to look like? We're not sure yet, but it's still, you're playing at Arizona. If they have everybody they need to have, they're the number 1 team in the country, in my opinion. Right. But, so I think it's a very strong schedule. It's going to get these guys ready without a doubt.
Right. I wanted to say something before we started breaking down the teams. I forgot. When I look at this, look at the conference, I think it's extremely deep this year. I see legit probably 9 teams that could be at least in the mix for a tournament bid. I don't think they'll get 9 bids. You never know. But would you agree with that? Do you think there's that many teams in this conference that could maybe, at least be in the mix for a tournament bid this year?
It's crazy because I think, if we're going down to the final couple weeks of the season, I could legitimately look around and say, you know what, I could see 10, 11 teams saying, we're only a game or 2 within each other of being in that top 7, top 8. The 11th place team could only be a game behind the 7th place team or whatever. There's a lot of different scenarios like that I could see. And so I don't think there's any doubt about it. I mean, I think, if SEC got less than 7 teams, I'd be surprised. I really would. I just think there's so many teams in the conference that are that deep. And when you compare it with other conferences around the country, especially these power conferences, I just don't think there's another conference in the country that's going to take the kind of leap that the SEC is going to take this year. Now, how far will that put them in relation to, say, the ACC, the Big 12? That's the question. But I still think they're the most improved conference in the country, and to me, that's going to equal at least a couple more bids in the tournament.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, let's move on. We're going to talk about Arkansas next. Arkansas has been a hot topic on my Twitter page.
Yes, it has.
So, the Razorbacks, they're coming off a pretty successful season. They won 26 games. They really blew a huge opportunity in the NCAA tournament. I mean, they had North Carolina on the ropes, didn't work out, but still, successful year. NCAA tournament bid, 26 wins. Kind of a new look team this year in a way. Macon and Barford are back. They return, one of the better backcourts you'll see in the conference. A lot of question marks up front. We've talked about it quite a bit this offseason. Moses Kingsley is a big loss for them. Especially, I don't think people do this when they're breaking down their team per se. They don't factor in that the conference is better.
Right.
So you lose your guys and you think you're still going to be good, but the conference is a lot better this year, so it's going to make it harder on your team. So looking at this roster, what's your overall take on Arkansas? Barford and Macon, like I said, really good players. Antoine Beard is a solid role player for them, but I think losing Moses Kingsley, losing Dusty Hanna, that's a really big hit. What's your overall take on the Razorbacks?
Well, and I do too, and I think it's one of those things, and I'm going to give you credit for this one because you've said it a lot this offseason. When you talk about how good Kingsley is, when you talk about how good Hanna's is, and then all of a sudden they're gone, and then it's like they were just role players. That's not true. Like, they were not role players. They were very important. I mean, you talk about Kingsley. He was the SEC preseason player of the year. Obviously didn't have the numbers to match that throughout the season, but that's kind of where you kind of look at him and say, hey, that's the kind of talent the guy had when he was on. He was very, very good. Hannah's the same way. It's just one of those guys that made shots, hit big shots. I mean, he was a guy that, if you need a three, give him the ball, he's going to make it. And so now you look around and you look at Macon and Barford, which I still think, one of the best combos in the country when you talk about just pure talent, pure athleticism, their ability to kind of change the game. But, it's more than just two guys. It has to be everyone else. And that's where, when you look around at this team, they have a lot of seniors. They have a lot of guys who are obviously older, but it doesn't always translate to experience. You have to look back at minutes played and all that kind of stuff. And when you look at the guys who are going to play bigger roles, it's like you kind of have to look at that too, because those guys have to step up because they're going to have a lot more minutes. Their roles are going to be a lot more expanded. And to me, that's the biggest question with Arkansas. It has to be those guys that can do that this year.
Right. Dustin Thomas is a guy, and Trey Thompson is probably the other guy. They're going to see bigger roles this year.
Right.
But, if they were so great, they would have saw more minutes last year. And I don't think, all of a sudden they're just going to turn it on in their senior year.
See, and that's the thing. And that's what you have to – you have to look at that. And people have to realize that is just because somebody's placed into a new role doesn't automatically mean, hey, they're going to be Moses Kingsley. They're going to be Dusty Hannes. And so that's where it's kind of wait and see on my end. I want to see how, Thompson and Thomas and all those guys come out and really kind of show that experience. Not, they haven't played a ton of minutes, and I understand that, but still having that leadership type of experience on this kind of team, that's going to be important. And look, they don't have to score, 15 a game and rebound 12 a game. They just have to be solid and consistent the entire way. And the good thing, I think, for Mike Anderson is he has options there in terms of, hey, if one guy doesn't work out, he's got three other guys. Dan Gafford, the really talented freshman. There's a lot of different guys he can turn to. I think it's just a matter of waiting and seeing which one of those big guys is going to step up and play that bigger role, because they have to if Arkansas is going to be an NCAA tournament team.
Absolutely. Two things I wanted to ask you about before we move on. Do you think perimeter shooting is going to be an issue for this team? Barford is not a good perimeter shooter. Macon is. Other than Macon, though, who is really on that roster that can knock down perimeter shots? Because I think it might be an issue.
Well, and that's something too. I think a guy like a freshman and like Khalil Garland could be someone that could step in. And, we still have to wait and see it. And it's weird because you look at all these different teams and we look at all these freshmen. But we don't know exactly how some of these freshmen are going to factor into the mix. We know Gafford's talented enough to be a guy that, come December could be their starting center. He could be the starting center for the rest of the year. And we understand that. But, guys like Garland and all that, how are they going to factor in? You talked about Beard, guys like that. There's a lot of depth in that backcourt. But like you said, Macon's definitely the best shooter on the team. And it's just a matter of seeing, how are people going to do around that? Because, look, if you look just based on offense, if you're the opposing team and you're going to play defense against Arkansas, you're going to put all, you're going to guard those two guys and say, hey, Thompson, Thomas, you guys have to beat us, because otherwise, hey, what are we doing? Those are the two guys we have to keep like that, I think.
Right. And one more question I wanted to ask you about on the defensive side of the ball. Mike Anderson is known for the 40 minutes of hell or whatever you want to call it. They gave up 74 points a game last year. Were they just not a regular Mike Anderson defensive team? What was the issue in your opinion? Well,
that's a strange one too, because I think when you look around, you look at last year versus this year, I don't think there's any doubt that the SEC offensively, just the entire league, is going to be much better this year than they were last year. And so, that's kind of a thing too, because Kingsley was a very good defender. He's someone who could certainly guard in the paint. And when you got the big guys around the SEC that we're going to talk about, guys like Austin Wiley, Mississippi State's big guys, Kentucky's big guys, that you're going to have to guard those kind of guys and keep them off the boards, especially rebounding wise. But no, they're going to play fast. And I think it's just a matter of, we've kind of seen sometimes Arkansas has felt like they can outscore teams. Well, they're going to have to outscore teams this year, especially, again, when we talk about those offensive losses. Are they going to have enough to make up for that and still be able to play those, 85-80 type of games? And I think that's very intriguing to me to see kind of how that's going to fall in terms of, are they going to play those high-scoring games this year, or are we going to kind of see that to where we're playing more 70-65 type of games? So that's going to be interesting.
So we're kind of wait and see on Arkansas pretty much. I mean, we got to see what can Gafford make an impact, and some of these role players from last year, up their game. Okay, so moving on. Auburn is the next team we're going to talk about. Interesting situation, obviously, with all that's going on with the FBI scandal. Chuck Pearson was arrested, and we all know that. But let's keep it on the court with Auburn. So from the looks of it, it seems to be in most people's eyes, this is the season where the Tigers are finally going to put it together, and we're going to see results. I think people are getting a little bit impatient. I think there's a lot of pressure on this year's team to succeed. Also, Bruce Pearl as well, obviously. Another down year, and then maybe that seat could get hot. Do you agree with that?
I think it's interesting, and here's what I would have said beforehand, before we saw all this happen, is when you look at the overall body of work and you compare it to Auburn's recent history in basketball. Second most wins last year they've had since 2003. That is what it is. I mean, it's a stat. It's something where you look at it and say, what is the expectation for Auburn basketball year in and year out? But I think since he's gotten there, the expectation is, hey, we saw Bruce Pearl do what he did at Milwaukee. We saw what he did at Tennessee. We expect that. Like, we want to see that same type of thing here. And, to not get to the NCAA tournament this year would be a disappointment. And, I mean, honestly, you have to look at this. It's easy to look at all the on-court talent. Like I've said before, if you just look at pure talent, I'd say Auburn is a top 3, top 4 SEC team just from top to bottom in terms of talent. Now, when you add in all the other stuff, defense, this FBI stuff, and look, we're not saying anything's going to happen anywhere else, but it's just how does something like that affect a team? And I don't think it's going to affect them as much when we're talking about getting into December, January, that kind of thing. But for now, is there anything that kind of hangs over anybody? And I think that's an interesting question. But if you're talking about pure talent, this team's very good. I mean, they're very good. And I think it's just, look, they have to be better on defense. If they're not better on defense, they don't have a chance. If they're better even halfway on defense, they are so good offensively, I think, that they're going to win a lot of games. So that's what we're going to see.
Last year, they were 321st in the country in scoring defense.
Yeah.
And they were 32nd in scoring offense. So we obviously know they can put the ball in the basket, but it's all about stopping the other team. And they just couldn't do it last year.
No.
Looking at their core guys, I mean, Mustafa Haran to me is a really special talent. And I don't think he got a lot of attention last year because, there's so many good freshmen, obviously in the SEC with Kentucky and whatnot. He averaged 15 and 6, 40% three-point shooter. I think he could definitely up those numbers this year. Austin Wiley is another guy. I think he's definitely on everybody's breakout list. But he has some health issues. Can you talk about that real quick?
Yeah, he's got the injury, and, I don't know the specific update as of right now, but I know that, he injured the same knee that he injured this summer, at the FIFA World Cup. And I think it's one of those things, or FIBA, not FIFA, that's soccer. It's one of those things where it's the same leg, but it's not the same injury. And so I think it's one of those things when you look at that and, you're like, well, a big guy like that, a leg injury, a knee injury type of thing, does it linger? I think it's too early to kind of say on that. But like you said, if you're talking about, I've said this for many months. I started this train in May when I was like, hey, Austin Wiley is going to be one of the most improved players in the country this year. There's no doubt about it, in my opinion. Just looking at the added size, the added strength. I mean, this guy, remember, he came in at December last year. He didn't get the off-season training. He didn't get the off-season chemistry building with any of the team, anything like that. He just kind of stepped in and had to play. And he looked pretty good doing it. You know what I mean? Like, he looked very good. But now you get that off-season under his belt. You get all that stuff, and, boy, he's going to be a monster. And you talked about Mustafa. I mean, here's a guy who's going to move from small forward to shooting guard. That's where he needs to play. He had to play out of position last year when they had the injuries with Purifoy and all that. Now moving there, you got Jared Harper, Davion Mitchell at the point. You feel pretty good about that. I think first 5 on Auburn, really good. The next 2, really good. And it's just a matter of seeing, again, I'm always going to look back at that defense and say, I have to see that before I can truly say I could see Auburn, on any given night beating Kentucky, Florida, Alabama, A&M, any of those types of teams. They just have to play defense.
Right. Davion Mitchell, I think, will definitely help on the defensive end too. From all I've heard, he's a really good defender, so that's definitely a plus. Also, Deshaun Murray, transfer from Presbyterian, averaged 20 points a game. Now, granted that he didn't do it in the SEC. What type of impact do you think he can make for the Tigers this year?
Well, and he's someone I've consistently kind of, when you're taking notes, you're getting ready for the season, I just keep circling his name because I think his versatility, and that's a word that Bruce Pearl used a lot. I've talked to him a couple times this offseason, and he's talked about that versatility. I mean, here's a guy, not a big guy, but he could conceivably play a 4, something like that, I think, because, you're going to see Auburn spread out a bit. You're going to have Wiley on the inside, that. And then, you have Harper, you have Heron, you have Purifoy, and, somebody like Murray, and you'll have other guys obviously coming in and out as well. But I think he's kind of that impact guy to where if he lives up to the potential, to what we think he could be, what Bruce Pearl thinks he could be, I think he could be, one of those guys where we're looking back and saying, what was the key to Auburn's success this year? Could be Deshaun Murray, I think.
Can I just say that I haven't heard his name at all this
offseason? See, that's weird. Yeah.
Everybody talking about Auburn, and nobody mentions Deshaun Murray. And the kid averaged 20 points a game at Presbyterian. So that should be interesting. So if things go well, I mean, they're probably at least a top 6-5 team in the SEC, correct?
I don't think there's any doubt about that. I mean, I really do. I mean, I think if they're better on defense, and if everything stays the way it is now in terms of, the full roster's there, which, again, we have no reason to expect it not to be right now. And so if that's the case, I would be surprised if Auburn did not make the NCAA tournament.
Bruce Pearl is a very good coach. I mean, we have to remember this. I mean, I feel like what he did at Tennessee gets overlooked. I mean, he turned that program around, and I think he did an outstanding job there. And I don't think it's like he forgot how to coach all of a sudden. They've also had some bad luck, transfer and injuries and stuff like that. So hopefully this is the season that it can come all together, and Auburn can get on the right side and make the NCAA tournament and make basketball, relevant, at least at Auburn. So moving on, we're going to talk about Florida next. Just to start off, I mean, how can we not say that the program didn't hit a home run with Mike White? He's doing it on and off the court. He's recruiting. He just picked up 2 recruits for next year's class this week. He's doing a great job. He really good defensive coach, in my opinion. They kind of get it done on both ends. They're coming off a great season with an Elite 8 run. They have a solid core returning. What's your overall take on the Gators, Blake?
I'm telling you, Tony, I like this team. And, I've talked about this before, and I've told you this offseason and other people as well, is, when you're looking around the SEC, you're saying, hey, who's going to be that number 1 team? Who's going to be that team that could take down Kentucky? I always come back to Florida, because it's not just the fact that, they have Kevon Allen, who's a Player of the Year candidate. It's not the fact that Chris Gio's is back, who, again, is just, to me, one of the most underrated, undervalued players in the entire country. And it's because he doesn't have a huge off. They'll be better this year. But when you think about defensively being a point guard, that type of thing, he's as good as it gets. Mm-hmm. And, we look around everywhere else, and, Mike White's got Jalen Hudson now in the mix. He's got Igor Kulichov, just a flat-out shooter, scorer. It'll be interesting to see how he kind of factors in. And then you go to the front court. I'd say now that we're talking about the start of the season, not having John Igbunu is certainly something that you have to look at and say, hey, if they're a different team. But then again, they got to the Elite 8 last year, and they didn't have him either. And so once he's back, he's going to add another layer. And look, we never know how guys are going to come back from an injury like that. And he's not going to be back until at least January. We're not going to know specifically, is he going to be the same type of player? Is he not? That's always a question with that. But Kavarius Hayes, another breakout type of player. Keith Stone, another breakout type of player. They've got the length. They've got the size inside to be okay without Igbunu until he gets back. DeAndre Ballard, Very good freshman, Chase Johnson, very good freshman. Their freshman class, I think, is kind of getting overlooked because you look around, Kentucky, Alabama, Missouri, look at all those guys coming in, but Florida's class is really, really good. And so you add all that together, you have a guy in Mike White who, like you said, absolute home run. He's not flashy, he's not a big loud and kind of all over the place type of guy, but he's a heck of a basketball coach. And I think Florida, to get him to follow in the footsteps of Billy Donovan, think about how tough of a job that is to do something like that. And look what he's already done.
Right. And I think John Igbugnu has been, the big storyline for them on the offseason, how he's not going to be back till January. And I keep telling people, Blake, Keith Stone, Kavarius Hayes, DeAndre Bell, they have a lot of depth up there.
Yeah.
So I think they'll get by without him, and I think they'll be okay. I especially think Kavarius Hayes is going to see a bigger role with this team. I think they're going to be more explosive offensively. You bring in with Jalen Hudson, the Rice transfer, Igor Kuliachov. He averaged 18 and 9. Do you agree with that?
Oh, yeah, no doubt. I mean, I think offensively, because, look, there's another situation where we talked about with Alabama. Allen is someone who got a lot of attention last year, but he's still going to get a lot of attention this year. But, however, they have other guys that can score too. Like I said, I think Chioza is going to be a better scorer this year. We talked about Hayes, especially in the front court too. He's going to add a new scoring touch, I think, to his game. And like you mentioned, with Hudson, Kulichov, these are two guys that have proven they can score. It's just a matter of seeing kind of how do they fit into the offense they're going to play there. And so it's going to be one of those things where, look, everybody's not going to be able to look around and say, hey, we're going to put all our defensive effort into Allen because Florida's got multiple scorers elsewhere.
Yeah, talking about Kevon Allen really quick, I think he's an SEC Player of the Year candidate. I think he really kind of had his coming out party in March. I thought he was excellent down the stretch.
Mm-hmm.
He really could show what he could do. What type of season do you see him having?
I mean, I'm telling you right now, if you ask me right now, I know we're going to get to this later, but I mean, if we're looking at every player in the SEC on paper coming into the season and guys that we know we feel very, very solid that are going to produce, going to put up the numbers, he's a top 3 SEC player to me. And we'll mention the other guys along the way, but he's that good. When he can score, he could just – it's one of those guys where he's like a Reggie Miller type. And I'm not going to compare him to Reggie Miller, say he's going to be the next Reggie Miller. But when we're talking about just guys that can score in a hurry, you could look up, and I think I wrote about this one time this offseason. It's one of those games where if you're watching Florida play, Allen's got 8 points at the 12-minute mark. You flip the channel, you come back, there's 10 minutes left, and he's got like 16. It's like he scores 8 points in 2 minutes. That's just the kind of guy he is to me. And so I think having that kind of scoring touch, and he's going to be the leader of that team, they could be the SEC regular season champion. I think he's right there at the top,
Absolutely. I totally agree. I would not be shocked if they won the league and, made another deep run in the NCAA tournament. So Florida's looking pretty strong, and we'll move on here to Georgia. So the Bulldogs are coming off a second straight NIT bid. Doesn't look like much will change, in my opinion. It might actually get worse. They came in, I think, 8th or 9th last year with J.J. Frazier. J.J. Frazier's out of the picture. They do return Yante Maton, but it just looks pretty thin to me. I don't know what you think. What's your thoughts on the Bulldogs?
Here's where I started with Georgia. I started and I looked at all the teams earlier this offseason, and I said, hey, I just don't see it. I don't see enough there to me for them to be, in that top tier of the SEC, in that top half. The more I look at them, though, you have Maton. You have a guy who obviously he's like Allen to me. When you talk about he's a for sure player of the year candidate. If you had to ask me today, he may be the guy I would pick. If you ask me today, I may change my answer tomorrow. But he's so good, and he's going to be even better. But you add Rayshawn Hammonds, a very good freshman. And Derek Ogbede is a guy I think that gets kind of underlooked as well because he's not a proven offensive scorer. He can rebound. When you talk about physicality, athleticism, he's as good as anyone in the SEC, in my opinion. But if his scoring load kind of comes along this year, because, look, we know everybody's going to turn their attention to Maton. So somebody else has got to score. And, they're not going to have to turn their attention to Frazier because he's gone. So Ogbede's going to have a chance to break out offensively. You go to that backcourt. Tyree Crump, Turtle Jackson, Juwan Parker, all those guys are going to decide whether Georgia could be a top 7 team or Georgia is a 12-13 team, in my opinion, because you have to be able to get the consistency from one or more of those guys in the backcourt, because we're going to talk about this more too. The SEC is so loaded at guard that you have to be really good or you're going to be in trouble.
Right. I think a positive for this team, I think this might be the deepest team Mark Fox has ever had. Do you agree with that?
I would say it's a very good possibility. And again, it comes back to those three guys we're talking about in the backcourt. If those guys can just be consistent, they don't have to, we don't have to have Jackson scoring 15 a game. You don't have to have Crump scoring 15 a game, because I think Maton's going to be your top scorer, obviously. Hammonds could be your second top scorer. I think Ogbede, again, could be someone that gets close to that 10, 11 points a game type of average. And so you just need them to kind of play good defense on the offensive end of the floor and get the ball where it needs to go in terms of, being able to get the ball on the offensive end of the floor to Maton and be able to kind of take some pressure off of him. And there's another team when you look about, Tony, can they shoot the ball well enough from outside to be able to factor into the mix? I think that's going to be another thing to watch with them as well.
Right. They're kind of in that wait and see mode too, like Arkansas, where, we could see them finishing 7th or 8th. We could see them finishing last. It's just, we don't know, Rayshon Hammonds is going to have to, step up and make an impact pretty quick. Before we move on, I wanted to ask you about Mark Fox. How do you think he's done at Georgia? I think he's got 145 wins in 8 years, 2 NCAA tournament appearances. Do you think his job could possibly be in jeopardy with a bad season? What's your thoughts on Mark Fox's overall job at Georgia?
I think it's definitely in jeopardy with a bad season. And I don't know that that's fair, but I just think the nature of the business, I think, if they finish 12th, 11, 12, 10, 11, 12, somewhere in there, I think you could look around and say, I think Georgia's going to probably take a look a little bit further and say, hey, where are we headed? Do we think we're headed in the right direction? But to me, he's another one of those guys where you talk about, look at this Georgia team last year. We talked about it before the season. I said it before the season. I said, look, if he doesn't get the NCAA tournament this year, I don't know what could happen. But Maton gets injured late in the season. They still have a chance at that point too when he gets injured. And so it's like, what happens if that doesn't happen? Do they make a run? Do they have a chance? But it still felt like they were underwhelming last year. You felt like they should have been better than they were with Frazier and Maton, having that combination. I don't know. It's an interesting scenario there to me because, as I always say, if you feel like you want to get rid of your coach that's been there for a while, you better know that whoever you're going to replace him with can, do the job, can recruit the way he could recruit, which, Mark Fox has gotten good players. I mean, let's not, he's gotten good players. It's just, but it has to translate into being able to win games. And in a tougher SEC, losing one of the most dynamic players, not only in the SEC, but in the country, and Frazier, that's the big question I think everyone has.
They had opportunities last year. I mean, they were in the mix for an NCAA tournament bid. They kind of faltered down the stretch, which was disappointing. But we'll see. Let's see how the freshman class pans out. Let's see if somebody can step up in the backcourt, and we'll see where Georgia finishes this year. Hopefully it's a successful year. So Kentucky's next on the list. Same old pretty much with Kentucky. Loaded recruiting class. The one thing with this team, if you even want to just compare it to last year, there's literally no experience almost. I mean, Wennon Gabriel was a pretty much small role player. He started, but he didn't play a lot of minutes. Last year's team, at least they had Derek Willis. At least they had, Briscoe and Dominique Hawkins. What do you think about Kentucky this year? Does the experience factor bother you? Because I'm a stickler for experience. I think it means everything in college basketball. You can have all the talent in the world, but you got to have some type of experience. What do you think about the Kentucky Wildcats overall?
I think if just looking at this Kentucky team now, this looks like a different team in a couple spots for me, just in terms about talking about a couple aspects. I think this Kentucky team is going to be a lot more vulnerable on the road than we've seen Kentucky teams in recent years be. It seems like, let's be honest, sometimes Kentucky, no matter where they play, it's a home game. But I think even with that kind of situation, I still think there's going to be some aspects about this team to where when they go on the road against a 8, 9, 10 team in the SEC, I don't know that you're talking about Kentucky being an overwhelming favorite like they would have been in recent years, just because the depth in the league is there. But not only that, but like you said, the inexperience in key spots on that team, I think is going to play a factor, especially when we get deeper into March. But it's another thing too, Tony, where I have spent all off season looking around and saying, who can take down Kentucky? And I still am not 100% convinced that anyone else is as talented from top to bottom. It's so hard. And that's very difficult.
I think looking out on the court, not throw the experience to the side. They have it all. They don't have a lot of holes. I think they have a lot of size up front. I think they can be a good shooting team. They have all the pieces, but can they put it together? All those pieces are 18-year-olds. So that's the main factor. Couple guys I wanted to ask you about. Ham Diallo, obviously. I think he's a really versatile kid. I think he could have a big year for them. I think he can probably play the 1, 2, or 3. What type of impact do you think Diallo has for the Cats this year?
Well, I think he's someone they're going to look at and say, hey, if we need to get the ball to somebody that we know that his athleticism is going to be able to get him to the paint to get us a basket, let's get the ball to him. Because I think, we've seen the athleticism. We look back at the NBA draft stuff he did this summer, talking about a guy with the vertical and that kind of thing. He's just such a great athlete. What they're going to need him to do, though, he's going to have to be a better shooter outside, I think, because that to me is, we've talked about this in recent years, and it's funny because it seems like this is what we always talk about with Kentucky. Do they have enough consistent shooting from outside? And we've always said that's going to be their biggest weakness, blah, 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 and yet they still get to the Sweet 16 or the Elite Eight. They always find a way, it seems. But this team I'm a little more concerned with in that regard. And he's someone I think is going to have to be, they're going to turn to him and say, hey, we need you to make outside shots. And so I think he, to me, is probably the most intriguing player on the roster coming into the season, just because I think when you look around at all the different players, he's one that's going to stand out as saying, okay, who is the, give me 1, 2 guys on Kentucky that could be that all SEC first team type of player if everything goes according to plan. And I think you would probably have to put him in there with a guy like probably Kevin Knox, I think.
Kevin Knox is the next guy I wanted to ask you about. Is he an SEC Player of the Year caliber talent, in your opinion?
See, and that's the big question, I think, because, I think if you just look at it on paper, who do I like more? I still like Maton better. I still like Allen better in terms of that race. But again, with Diallo and Knox, to me, if you just had to say today, okay, who's going to be the most important player on Kentucky's team? To me, I think you narrow it down to those 2 guys. It's going to either be Diallo or it's going to be Knox. And so I think that's where it's like, we always do this. Although last year it feels like we had a better handle on things, because we looked at De'Aaron Fox and we said, look, he's 100% sure thing, no doubt about it. Malik Monk, 100% sure thing, no doubt about it. Bam Adebayo, 100% sure thing, no doubt about it. But I think when you look at this team, it's like we feel pretty good about all these guys, but do we think they are going to make that type of impact? And I think that's a fair question, because, and it's tough to make that comparison because we've seen all these good players that Calipari's gotten in there, but you're always going to have to make that comparison and say, okay, here's the next group. Are they going to be able to be that type of, impact that those guys made? And that's a question I think that's fair.
I actually tweeted this out the other day. I think we tend to overrate class ranking. We get too caught up in class ranking and recruiting classes, and we forget not every single freshman who comes in makes a giant impact, regardless of how talented they are. It's a big adjustment going from high school to college. So before we move on, right now, is Kentucky your number 1 team in the SEC?
To me, and again, like I said, it's hard for me to pick someone else right now. And look, I told you this. I've told everyone my preseason power rankings are coming out on Tuesday, so be sure to check that out at southeasthoops.com. But right now, it's still hard for me to look elsewhere and say I feel as good about somebody else as I do about Kentucky. And, it's hard because you just look at all that talent and you say Calipari is going to find a way to put it all together. But it's going to be more difficult, I think. And here's something else I'll say, too, quickly. We've seen years where Kentucky's gone 16-2 in the SEC, 15-3 in the SEC. I don't see it this year. I see, they could lose 5 games. They could lose 6. Wouldn't surprise me. Kentucky could finish – and how about this? Kentucky could finish 2nd, 3rd, 4th. I wouldn't be shocked. because that's how good to me that the SEC is. And I could certainly make a case for saying, if the end of the season comes around, could I see Texas A&M being one? Yes. Could I see Alabama being one? Sure. Could I see Florida being one? Absolutely. And I don't think that's any surprise when you talk about, to me, those are your top tier teams, just in that top four. But it's just, who knows? Who knows? So we'll see.
Right. Okay. LSU is the next team we're going to talk about. And I just think we have to start, obviously, with the addition of Will Wade. He comes in and he's already making an immediate impact, recruiting-wise. He's doing a tremendous job. He brings in some solid guys this year. Tremont Waters was a great snag, point guard, a talented kid. Randy Unsar from Southern Utah, volume scorer, to help this year's roster. I'm not sure how great this year's roster will be, but he's definitely building for the future. How do you feel about the job he's doing so far? And what's your thoughts? What's key on this year's team? What are your thoughts on the Tigers?
Well, I think in terms of the job he's doing, I mean, I think he's done it the right way in terms of saying, look, as soon as he got there, I can remember one of the quotes, and I wish I could remember exactly how it went, but, he was like something about, they were all wearing, I think it was different team gear or something, no wonder we, kicked your, what last year. And it's like, it's hilarious to me because he's right. Like he's trying to build that team building type of stuff. And that's what you have to do in your first year, especially in a situation like this where they were so bad last year. And, this is a team that's, underachieved for many years now. We've talked about it consistently. But, it's one of those things where if you just look at what he's done from that kind of building the culture, he's out and about. He's all over campus. He's trying to get people back into it, LSU basketball. We saw towards the end of last year, we didn't know if there was 100 people in the stands sometimes when you saw the pictures of the crowd and that kind of thing. But now that he's doing that, he's putting everything in place that he's put in place. However, it's not going to be an overnight fix, especially on the defensive end of the floor. There's a lot of good offensive players. Breathe, very good, I think. Brandon Sampson, I think, could have a big year. You talked about Waters, Anwasor, another guy who has proven scoring. I think they've got some good offensive players. But just like, with other teams, are they going to be good enough on the defensive end of the floor? We know he's going to stress that. But are these guys going to buy in? And could it be a situation where, sometimes he's not able to play his best offensive players because they don't play good enough defense? And so he may just say, this is my first year. We'll take our losses. But look, if you don't play defense, you're going to be on the bench. And so I think we could see some situations like that this year because I think he's going to do it the way to where he understands they're not going to be, it's going to be hard for them to win a lot of games this year. But I think it's one of those things where he's going to make the tweaks along the way he needs to wait to get them ready for the future. And that's the most important thing, I think, for them this year.
I think that the program, I know it's a football school, but I think the program in general is capable. It has capabilities of, being one of the better programs in the SEC. I mean, they have great fans, obviously, if they can just get into basketball games, that would be great. Just real quick before we move on, I want to talk to you about a couple guys. Duop Reith, I thought, was one of the more undervalued guys in the league last year. He averaged 12 and 6, played really well. Also, Skyler Mays, to me, seems like a guy that'll take that next step this year. What do you think about those two players?
Yeah, I think so too. And I think it's always interesting to see how guys are going to fit into a new system because, look, they're going to try to play fast. We know that. It could be one of those things where I think Waters is the kind of point guard to where he can get those guys open. I think he's good enough point guard to where, he'll get Reed shots, he'll get Sampson shots, he'll get Mays shots. And I think on the offense, it's intriguing because, how are they going to play specifically? Who's going to be that breakout guy? Because you never know with the new coaching staff. You never know kind of who could fit in the best. And, guys like that, you like to talk about with somebody like Mays could be one of those guys kind of under the radar, may not get a ton of attention going into the season, but, would it surprise you if he kind of turns into one of those breakout guys that average several figures? I don't think so. Because there's so many unknowns with the new staff and such, and so you just don't know. But, I'd be surprised if we're not talking about guys like Reed, Sampson, Mays, and obviously Waters, those kind of guys, I think, towards the top in terms of scoring on that team.
Now, before we move on, what do you think would be put a goal on it? Do you think they could get to 15 wins? in that area?
I mean, I don't think it would be out of the realm of possibility, I think, because like I said, I think just if they can just get that buy-in on defense, we know that defense could win them a couple close games, especially at home, against maybe lower tier SEC teams this year. I don't think we're talking about an LSU team that's going to finish the year at 2-16 in the SEC. I mean, I think this team has the potential to win games. And look, let's be honest, they have the potential to not finish in that last spot, which they're going to be picked last by pretty much everyone. But there's the potential to where, hey, if you get that buy-in, they have enough athletes to implement that defensive style. You have a couple good scores. If everything goes right, they can win some games. But I think realistically, like I said, it's going to be a learning year for a lot of these guys. It's going to be a year of putting in your foundation if you're Will Wade. And so, like you said, I mean, we're talking about, if they get to 500, good job. I think it's one of those things where you'll be fine with that.
Yeah, I think sometimes we forget a first-year coach, new system. That's a big adjustment.
Mm-hmm.
So just getting used to the new system, the new way they play, it's tough.
Especially coming from the old system, which was not good. So.
Okay, so we're going to move on. Mississippi State. Now, Mississippi State's a pretty interesting team. I feel okay about them. I felt like, I would have felt better if Mario Kegler stuck around, but he didn't. He transferred. They lose IJ Reddy also. But the backcourt, I think, should be really, really strong. I mean, Quindary Weatherspoon is one of the better players in the country, not just the SEC. I don't think he gets a lot of attention. Lamar Peters, I think, is a really talented kid. Eric Coleman up front, he's a really talented kid I like as well. What do you think about, going into year 3 at Mississippi State for Ben Howland? What type of team do you see this turning out to be this year?
Well, Mississippi State's one of those teams, and we're going to talk about another one here in a minute very soon. If you ask me who are my sleeper teams in the SEC, they're 1 and the other they're 1A, and the other team we're going to talk about here in a minute is going to be 1B, because I just think if we're talking about purely talent-wise, you have a guy who could score 20 a game in Weatherspoon. You have the big guys inside that are so athletic. They can rebound very well. They can block shots. They can alter the dynamic of another team's offense. So we're talking about all these good guards in the SEC. If they get into the paint against Mississippi State, it's not going to be easy to score. And then you look around at that backcourt, it's really good. Like, it's really, really good. We talked about Nick Weatherspoon, another guy. There's so many different guys, I think, that they can turn to in that backcourt. Lamar Peters, like you mentioned. Well, if everything comes together, if they finally make that stride to where, hey, we can consistently rely on Eric Coleman inside. We can consistently rely on Schneider Herard inside. Abdul Adu, the new guy, Ben Howland loves him. He loves his energy, thinks he's going to come in right away and make an impact. If all those guys can be better in the front court, their guards are as good as anyone in the SEC. When we talk about 1 through 4, just in the back court. This team, I mean, would I be shocked if Mississippi State somehow put everything together and made the NCAA tournament? No, I wouldn't at all, because you look at this team last year, and I always bring up this stat. I think towards the end of last year, they lost something. I don't know if it was 7 in a row. Somewhere towards the end of last year, they had a pretty big losing streak, and they lost a lot of games. Maybe may have won 1 or 2 in there. A lot of those games they lost by 7 points or less. And so remember how young they were, youngest team in the country last year. Add that extra year of experience. You still have some young guys there that have to play a lot, but even that added year of experience, you go back last year, if they don't lose 8 of those games, whatever, by 7 points or less, even if you win 4 of those games, it's a completely different dynamic. And so if you add more of that this year, I'm telling you, man, they're a team too. When I've done my power rankings, I've moved them further and further up just because I think the talent's there. We just have to see how it all comes together.
Exactly. I was just going to say, the talent is great, but can they figure things out? We'll see. What would you, before we move on, where would you put them right now? What area?
I think realistically, you're going to see Mississippi State be in that maybe anywhere from 9 to 12 range. I think that's probably where most people are going to land on them. I think, SC Media Days next week, I have a feeling they'll probably be picked 11th, 12th would be my guess. But I don't know. I mean, is that too low? I mean, that's the thing. We don't know. And you have to see that experience. And I think it's another thing where, look, we've talked about it with other teams. It's wait and see. We can make a case for why they could be really good, but we could also make a case for why we could see them struggling again.
Right. And I think but for an example, I think they make a case for the league to show you how good the league is, because we're talking about how talented they are, and we're talking about that they could finish 12th.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody else gets better too, and that's the problem. You know, you could say, like I said, you could say they lost a lot of those close games last year, and even if they win half of those, but look, it's going to be harder to win half of those, even with that extra year of experience. So, there's no guarantees, of course.
Okay. Moving on. Okay, Missouri, obviously one of the more exciting teams to talk about this offseason. They've been really one of the teams we've heard about a lot. You bring in a new coach in Quanzo Martin. You have a transcendent talent in Michael, Jr. there. This is a program that could have a huge turnaround. On paper, this team looks great. Will they meet expectations is the question. Quanzo Martin, to me, he's had some, solid success as a coach. He's never really had a team this talented, in my opinion. What do you think? How do you think Quanzo does with this roster and this program?
Well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? I think that's the biggest question coming into the season is, what is the expectation? And I think when you look back at his resume, what he's done in previous stops, it's fair to question and say, hey, he's got all this talent, but is it going to be different than other situations he's had in other places? And again, that's a fair question to me. But it's another one of those teams where, boy, I have moved them very far up. And it's just one of those things where I think if you just look at pure talent, and a lot of people are going to go off of the wrong thing here. A lot of people are going to look at last year and say, there's no way a team could be that bad last year and be that much better this year. Well, guess what? Yes, they can, because they have the number one recruit in the country. They have a guy who, again, when we're talking about those top 3, top 4 SEC Player of the Year candidates, Michael Porter Jr. is right in there because he's that good. And he's someone who can change the game in so many different ways. But it's not just Michael Porter Jr. It's a very talented freshman class. With Dante's there now. I mean, here's another. I mean, they have, I think it's 5 guys on the roster at 6'10" or taller. And 3 of those guys are going to be, rotation players. And so that's a lot of good size. But guess what? It's more than that, too. It's Jordan Barnett, who averaged double figures last year. It's Kevin Puryear, who averaged double figures last year. Terrence Phillips, a guy who I think could be a really breakout type of player. You're talking about a guy that could go from averaging, how many assists he averaged last year to averaging, 8, 9 assists a game, because he's got all these offensive weapons that he can kind of go to. And again, I would remind everyone, if you're going to look at Missouri and say, I just can't see them, making a big jump, look at how bad they've been, it's completely different, because everything about Missouri is going to change. It's a completely different culture, completely different leadership, which I know we have questions about. But talent-wise, you have the best freshman in the SEC, the best freshman in the country, arguably, and that can kind of mean a lot when you think about that kind of thing. So,
absolutely. And another guy that you didn't mention who I think can make a pretty sizable impact for them is Cassius Robertson, transfer from Canisius. He averaged 15 points a game for them last year. He's a grad transfer. So I think that'll be a solid addition, veteran leadership. This is going to be somewhat of a young team, because I think a lot of these young guys you mentioned in the Porter brothers and Jeremiah Tillman, they're going to see a lot of minutes. So Jordan Barnett is a guy that is really intriguing to me. Averaged 12 and 6 last year, really figured things out. What type of jump do you think he can make? I know you mentioned him, but I'd like to know your full thoughts on him.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think he's the guy to where he's going to kind of be overlooked, because everybody's going to say, well, how good is really the best player on a really, really bad team? And I think that's unfair, because you can't, they were bad, but it's another situation where I think if you look at Missouri last year, I don't remember the stat. I looked it up this summer and I'll have to find it, but they lost a lot of close games too. They lost a lot of games by 5 points or less. And they lost a ton of games that way. And, now you add so much talent and you have Barnett coming back, someone who has proven, he can be that guy to get them, if everybody's keying in on Michael Porter Jr., we feel pretty confident, I'd say, getting the ball to Jordan Barnett and saying, we need you to score. We need you to make this play. And so because of that, that gives you options too. And so I just think you're looking at Porter Jr., Michael Porter, Dante Porter, those kind of guys we know, but don't forget about Jordan Barnett. Don't forget about Terrence Phillips. And I'm glad you brought up Robertson because he's someone that I just forgot about because, I've talked about him all summer too. And it's like, there's another option on offense. And he helps them in the shooting category. They weren't a great shooting team last year, especially just jump shooting. They were very low in terms of percentages. I don't have it in front of me, but very bad just in terms of shooting percentage. He immediately helps them there. And like you said, they have other shooters as well. They're going to be a hard team to guard. I think that's the biggest – if you want to label Missouri, they're going to be very difficult to guard with all that size, with all the versatility. And to me, that definitely matters because if you can't guard them, they're going to play good defense because they have that size. And we know, that's one of Conzo Martin's strengths too is defense. So that's a pretty good combination to have, I think.
Right. He's never had this much talent. It is a question mark in my mind, because like we said, he's pretty much been a okay coach throughout his career. He hasn't done anything, outstanding, but he's got the talent. The pieces are in place, so it should be exciting. They're definitely going to be an improved team, so we'll see what happens. Moving on, Ole Miss, 22 games, won 22 games last year. NIT team. I love this backcourt. I think it's deep. It's exciting. A lot of talented kids back there. Andy Kennedy pretty much wins 20 games every year. I think he's a really overlooked coach. I think he's won 20 games 9 out of 11 years. He's done a great job down there. Not an easy place to win, obviously. I'm sure they would like to see a few more NCAA tournament appearances, but I think he's done a good job. This year's club should be competitive again. It's going to be tough to replace Sebastian Saez. I think it's pretty simple with this group. Excellent backcourt, but who steps up in the front court? What's your thoughts?
Yep, that's it. Like that to me is the question. If they don't have a guy like Dominic Olenichak step up, the Drake transfer, he's going to have to play. Bruce Stevens is a guy that Andy Kennedy is very high on. I think he's someone who thinks could come in, if they have to play that. This could be one of those teams we talk about. And there are several teams in the SEC that could do this year. Play a lot of guards. I mean, they could play everyone out on the perimeter. I think that's a possibility. And so if they do that, you just need somebody, like we've said, Olenichak, whoever kind of steps up and mans that front court, you just have to be consistent. And I think you just need somebody that can score 8 a game, rebound 8 a game. That's all you need because you got enough help elsewhere. And defensively too, there's another one of those teams on the defensive end. Their guards can really score. But are they all going to be committed on the defensive end of the floor? And that's a fair question too, I think, because you just don't know. And because that perimeter defense could be a little iffy, that's not going to be a good combination. And are we going to run into a situation where Ole Miss is a team where we say, all right, here's another team that to win games, they're going to have to score 85 a game or they're not going to win. But they're certainly talented enough on the offensive floor. Like you said, I want to echo that. I would put Ole Miss's backcourt, when you're talking about starting with DeAndre Burnett, Brianne Tyree, Terrence Davis, Markel Crawford. I'll be honest with you. I would put that against anybody's backcourt in the SEC and feel pretty good about my chances because they're all very good players. And I just think with Ole Miss, it's going to come down to can they play well enough on defense? Can they get that production inside?
Right. 207. They were one of the worst defensive teams in the country last year. And another thing I think that kind of gets overlooked because, they're pretty much volume scorers is, DeAndre Burnett, Terrence, they're not very efficient. DeAndre Burnett shoots, under 40% from the field, under 40% from three. I think that they need to improve on that as well. So efficiency might be an issue this year. One guy I wanted to ask you about is Brianne Tyree. He's on my breakout list in the conference. I think he could have a really strong year for them. What do you think he does for the Rebels this year?
Well, and he should be because, I've said it this summer too. We talked to Andy Kennedy on the podcast, and I've heard him, it wasn't just on the podcast. He said it in the SEC coaches teleconference this summer, the one name you can just hear, and he said it. He's like, look, I'm telling you guys, Brianne Tyree is the guy that's been the most impressive in my mind just in terms of the biggest strides he's made this offseason of anybody on the team. And so, we saw what he did, had a very good, offseason last year, played very well in the NIT, played very well down the stretch for them. And it goes back to that thing to where we mentioned all these names and, like you said, efficiency questions. There's going to be less shots to go around for everyone this year because you have all those guys. I mean, Markel Crawford's there now. So, more shots are going to be able to – so, if guys are getting 10 shots a game, are they going to be able to make 5 or 6 of those? And, it's one of those things where you talk about that efficiency, that come into play. But I think Brianne Tyree, when we talk about those 4 guys specifically in the backcourt, he could be one of those guys where going into the season, he may be last on that list in terms of just the hype that he gets. But by the end of the season, he could be the guy we're talking about the most because I think Andy Kennedy has that much confidence in him right now.
Absolutely. And then you add Devontae Shuler, who's a 4-star shooting guard. So he's probably going to see some time for them as well. I do think it was somewhat of a hit, especially front court wise. They lost Jamarco Pickett to Georgetown. He was a commit. I thought he could definitely help out in the front court. So I think they'll have to figure things out in the front court. But like we said, very talented backcourt. They can cause a lot of problems for other teams. All right, so moving on, South Carolina, next team we're going to talk about real quick. The Gamecocks are coming off a magical season pretty much. They made it all the way to the Final Four. Nobody saw that coming. This team will have a little bit of a different look, obviously. Sindarius Thornwell and P.J. Dozier are out of the mix, graduate in an NBA draft for Dozier, off to the NBA. Also, Dwayne Notice, who was a really good player for them for a long time, he's out of the mix. Interesting group here, though. I like Maia Kotsar up front. I think he's going to see a bigger role for them. Chris Silva, I thought, played great down the stretch for them, especially in the NCAA tournament. What do you think about South Carolina? We know they're probably going to be a good defensive team, but do you think they just lose too much to be in the NCAA mix?
At least on paper, I think it's hard to look at this team and say, okay, you have to replace Sindarius Thornwell. You have to replace P.J. Dozier, Dwayne Notice. Rakim Felder is not there right now. Right. You're talking about 4 guys that were a very important part of a team that made it to the Final Four. And that's just a lot to me. And it's another thing, I think, where we look around and say, hey, they're just wait and see on some of these players. We know Silva was really good towards the end of the year. How does he respond in the guy role? You know what I mean? It's like he has to be the guy now. So his role is completely different to where he's the 4th guy on the roster last year that, hey, I could benefit because everybody else is looking at Thornwell and Dozier and all that. But now when all the attention is on me, how do I, is it the same? And I think that's a good question to ask. And you talked about Kotsar. I think he's someone who's going to be able to obviously take a bigger role because he's going to have that opportunity to score more. Elsewhere, that's my question. And I just don't think the depth is there right now. I think you look at guys like David Beatty, a freshman guy is going to come in. Corey Holton, we know is there now. I think he's definitely going to be able to help them in that backcourt, of course. He's going to be able to come in. I think he's going to be a scorer that they can kind of rely on. But what about everything else? And I think, that's the question to me. But I'll tell you this, Tony. I don't know how many years in a row now we have gone into SEC Media Day. We've come out of SEC Media Day. Where did South Carolina get picked? Oh, gosh, they got picked 10th, 12th, 8th. It's like, oh, yeah, and where did they finish that year? Oh, that's right, they finished 3rd, 4th, 5th. It's like we do this every time, but I think this is a little bit of a different scenario because I think Frank Martin's had talent there, and he still has talent this year. But I think it's a little easier to say, okay, I'm finally going to go against Frank Martin this year because I just feel much more confident now. I might have picked them 10th last year, but this year you feel a little bit better because I just don't think they have that guy that they need to.
Right, and you mentioned depth, and the whole Rakim Felder situation just makes that worse. I mean, if he was there right off the bat, I might feel a little bit better, but with his suspension and him going to miss at least the first semester, I believe, it is a big hit for them. But again, as you just mentioned, Frank Martin, one of the best coaches in the country, in my opinion, he's an absolute psycho, which I love. I love watching him coach. I just love watching him. He's crazy, but in a good way. So Yeah, South Carolina is definitely an interesting team, so we'll have to keep an eye on them, see how they do. Now, the next team we're going to talk about is Tennessee. Tennessee is a team I've been talking up all off season. I'm really intrigued with the Vols. This was a team last year that you have to remember. They were in the NCAA tournament mix for quite a while. They faltered down the stretch, but Rick Barnes returns 5 players who average 7 points or more. They had a guy like James Daniel from Howard, averaged 27 points a game last year. He was number 1 in the country. So you add him to a group. They got a lot of impact sophomores. They're still a young team. They're going to have to, figure things out without Robert Hubbs. What do you think about Tennessee? Because I really like this team a lot.
Well, they're another team. I think you look at their guards and you say, boy, that guard group is really, really good. And I think, boy, guard play in the SEC this year, oh, my goodness. If you love watching guards play basketball, this is the league for you because, my goodness, there's so many good guards in this league. But then you go elsewhere. And I think that's where the issues start popping up. You say Grant Williams is very good. He's a second team, a first team type of SEC, all SEC player. I mean, he could be that good this year. 2 30-point games last year. And we've talked to some guys this offseason, feel really good about his development, being able to expand his game further. They're not a big team. Don't have a ton of size. And I think they're another one of those kind of teams where you could say, okay, they're going to be playing a lot of guards. They're going to be playing Grant Williams and put the ball out there. Let's roll with that, see what happens. And that would be a bad combination to have. And like you said, I still think, and I've heard this from some people this offseason, well, if Rick Barnes doesn't win this year, let's move on. It's like, you serious? Like, no. Like, it's just not at all. Like, it's only, people have to remember it takes some time with these kind of things. Remember what he stepped into. There's another situation where, here's a guy who was at Texas for so long, and you come into a new job. I mean, it's an adjustment period for him, too. Even as experienced of a coach that he is, it's still an adjustment period, and you still have to get your guys in there. And I think he's been able to do that, especially this year when you talk about the transfer guys that have come in, both with Daniel, JUCO guys as well, that kind of guy. They've got a good freshman coming in as well. There's a lot to like about this team. I just wonder if maybe there's just another depth thing where you say, can their 1 through 7 match up with, a lot of the top 7 SEC teams 1 through 7? I think that's an interesting question to me. But when you think about how close they were to making the tournament last year, when I don't think any of us thought they had a chance in the world to be even in that situation, I mean, can we really say for sure that, hey, Tennessee is definitely going to be 10 through 14 in the SEC? If they make the NCAA tournament, they're in that group of maybe 6 or 7 teams where if you say, would it surprise you if Tennessee somehow made the NCAA tournament? No way. Like, I think they have the talent to get there.
You mentioned Rick Barnes and people saying that he was on the hot seat. I mean, I just think some of us are so impatient. Basketball fans are impatient in general. I think that's a perfect example. It takes time to build a program. It takes time to get your players in and get your system down. So before we move on, I wanted to ask you about Chris Darrington, the JUCO transfer they bring in this year. He averaged 20 points and 7 assists last year. Do you think he makes a pretty big impact?
Well, I think they liked the way he played in their overseas trip this summer. I mean, he was one of the guys they talked about and said, hey, we're really happy with where he's at. We think he's obviously going to be in the mix with all those guys we've mentioned in the backcourt with Daniel, Jordan Bone, Jordan Bowden, all those guys. Turner's back. There's a bunch of guys in there. So you're like, who's going to be the 2 guys that kind of step up? And I think it's easy to look around and say, well, Daniel, because of that scoring, prowess he's had over the years, we've seen what he could do at Howard. Obviously, it's a different situation, but then you look at Turner or Bone or Bowden, any of those guys, and say, I could just as easily see any of these guys putting up 20 a game, and I don't mean every game, but, they could put up 20 in a game and you wouldn't be surprised. Is Darrington going to be that kind of guy too? And that's the thing, he's another proven scorer at another level, but, how does that translate? I think Rick Barnes has a lot of options in that backcourt, and that's a good problem to have. I think, again, it's just the key for him is going to be how do we develop these young guys in the front court? Can we get enough, and they're not going to need it on the offensive end of the floor. They just need those guys to play really good defense. You have a superstar type of player in Grant Williams. Tennessee has an interesting makeup, and I do think they're one of those teams where, when we see the preseason media polls come out and stuff in the SEC next week, I just think you're probably going to see Tennessee picked 10th or lower. And is that going to happen? Would it surprise me if they're in the top 7? Maybe. I don't think it'll be that shocking because they have the talent and they have a really, really good coach.
Yeah, if they would be my sleeper team if you asked me today. Yeah. I really like this group. Okay, moving on. This is a team I really, really wanted to talk about tonight, Texas A&M. This is a group that I'm really excited about. I moved them all the way up to number 15 in my early poll. I really believe in this team. Roster-wise, I think if you put their roster against some of the other talented rosters in the country, you can match them up. They're legit. They have talent everywhere. And last year, the big struggle was obviously point guard play. They just could not initiate offense. They were not a good offensive team. This year, J.J. Caldwell comes in. He could be the straw that stirs the drink this year. Robert Williams, to me, is a guy that I don't think some college basketball fans know who this kid is. I really believe that. This kid is a top 5 pick. One of the better front courts in the country with Tyler Davis. Tell me your thoughts on the Aggies. Are you excited as I am?
Here's the thing with Texas A&M, and I think I would make this argument to anyone that asks me right now. I think I could legitimately look at Texas A&M and say they have the best top 6 in the SEC. If we're talking about their top 6 players, maybe top 5, but I'm going to tell you why I think it's top 6. Tony Trojan-Morelos is someone I don't think gets enough credit because everybody knows Tyler Davis, they know Robert Williams, but this guy coming off the bench, he's very, very good, and he's someone we've seen make a big impact for them in recent years in big spots. Even with that co-regular season champion team a couple years ago, he was playing quality minutes for them then. I think he's going to be an even bigger impact player this year. It's his last season there. I just think they're so good. Admon Gilder, one of the most underrated players in the country. He does not get enough credit for his ability to score. And now, I talked to Billy Kennedy this offseason. He talked about that. He said, look, Admon had to play point guard last year because we saw how many issues they had at point guard. He's like, he's not a natural point guard. He is a natural scorer. And because he had to play point guard last year, he couldn't reach his effectiveness. He couldn't reach that height on offense. Well, guess what? He still scored at will, late in the season especially. He was one of the best scorers in the SEC at the end of the season. There was no doubt about it. He had really come along. And now you got Caldwell at point. You feel pretty good about that, I think. Gilder at the 2. DJ Hogue's back, fully healthy. Robert Williams, Tyler Davis, Tony Troca. They're really, really good, man. They are really, really good.
Absolutely. I love Gilder's versatility. He rebounds, he dishes, he scores. I love that kid. I really do. And then you bring in Dwayne Wilson, grad transfer from Marquette, which just bolsters their rotation. And I think he could be a really good scorer for them. Now the question is, Caldwell, he misses last year. He had some issues. He's already suspended this year early on. So that's got to be a little bit of a concern, no?
I would say so, but I think what you just mentioned is why maybe it's not as concerning if you're a Texas A&M fan because you have Wilson there now. And you feel pretty good about him being a better option than they had last year at that position. And so I think, with that, we know Caldwell will be back, but I do think if Caldwell has one of those situations where, look, it's his first season on the floor there with them. He got to practice with them last year and all that, which was very helpful. I think that's what we're going to see is a big kind of deal because just being there, getting that practice is very important, even when you have to sit out an entire year. But if Wilson come in, kind of be just the guy that can get the ball where it needs to go, they just could never get the ball. You have a true point guard. But now you have Wilson, you have Caldwell. They just need to spread the wealth. Just spread the ball around to Gilder, Hogue, Davis, Williams. You're going to be fine, I think.
And real quick, Williams isn't even a finished product. He was a kid last year who's still raw, and he averaged 12 points, 8 rebounds, blocked almost 3 shots a game. He's a legitimate, top 5 NBA draft pick. And like I said at the start, You could make a case for this roster against anybody almost. From like you said, from the top 6 or 7 guys. So I think Texas A&M is absolutely a championship contender in the SEC. I think they can make some noise if Caldwell gets back, plays well, and things go well for them. So Texas A&M, definitely a good team, and definitely a team we're going to have to keep our eye on. Last team tonight we're going to talk about is Vanderbilt. First I'll just say absolutely love the Bryce Drew hire last year. I think he showed right away that he can coach at this level. He's recruiting well already. I'm very interested in this group. I'm interested to see how they move on without Luke Cornett. Luke Cornett was a very important factor for them. Stretch bigs are such a big weapon, especially in college basketball. What are your thoughts on Vanderbilt? Do you think they'll be okay without Cornett?
That is, to me, the biggest thing, to where if you asked me today and said, why shouldn't I pick Vanderbilt in the top 7 of the league? Why should I not think they're a top half team? It's that reason. Is because it's not just the fact that they lose Luke Cornett. It's the fact that he did things that you just don't see many 7-foot guys be able to do. He can step out, knock down threes consistently. He could just do so many different things well, and that was such an important part of how teams game planned against Vanderbilt last year, or throughout the years, really. And I think that's always kind of, well, how are they going to game plan now that they don't have a 7-foot guy to prepare against, that can play inside, outside, block shots, completely affect the game on both ends of the floor, especially on the defensive end in the paint. How does that change things? Well, here's the good news. The good news is that Riley LeChance is back. Matthew Fisher-Davis is back. Jeff Roberson is back. You have all those guys back. Those 3 right there, which, to me, that's their big 3. Those are the 3 guys you can lean on and say, hey, if we get in close situations, we feel pretty good about one of these 3 guys being able to make a play. LeChance, one of the best 3-point shooters in the SEC, was the best 3-point shooter statistically in the SEC last year. Matthew Fisher-Davis, we know he had his ups and downs, but if he's all there, if he's at the top of his game, again, he's one of those, he's a second team, all SEC type of player. He's that good. He's a top 10 player in the SEC when he's on his game. He has to play better on the defensive end. Jeff Roberson, another guy I absolutely love. I've told you this multiple times. He's just one of the most undervalued players that there is in college basketball, because he can do so many different things. He can shoot the ball. He can play defense. He can guard any position on the floor. I just love his game, and I think he's going to be another guy this year that's very important in replacing Cornett. You go beyond that. Are the big guys. Kevon Brown, I think, has the potential to take a big step forward. He has to take a big step forward, because Jerry Baptiste, Ejike Obena, those are the 2 other big guys they're going to have in there. They're going to look around and say, hey, we feel like these guys are going to be aggressive enough to give us a chance, but those are still guys I think that are developing. And that's where you look at Vanderbilt and say, hey, they have enough, I think, in that starting 5. Look, I haven't even mentioned Joe Toye yet. Joe Toye, another guy who could be a breakout player. They have enough in that top 5, top 6. Let's see how everyone else progresses. But if you ask me right now, here's another team where I think Vanderbilt can be an NCAA tournament team. I've moved them around a lot in my rankings. But, boy, I just, I don't know. How do they play without Cornett? That's what I want to see.
Well, I think it comes down to, if Toye and Brown, are breakout guys and it works out, then they're probably a tournament team. I just wanted to mention Riley LeChance. I think he might be the most underrated point guard in the nation. I really do. He's very efficient. He doesn't turn the ball over, knockdown 3-point shooter, as you mentioned. I wanted to ask you about Matthew Fisher-Davis. What's his deal? I know that you're pretty entwined in the SEC. Did you hear anything about him last year? What were the problems with him?
Well, and look, here, we talked about this earlier. I think when you have a new coaching staff, there are always going to be adjustments. And let's think, too, about what they lost, from the year before. They lost Wade Baldwin. They lost Damian Jones. They lost a pretty good group of players that made his life a lot easier on the floor, And so there was an adjustment period last year, I think, not only on the floor but off the floor with Bryce Drew, and you're always going to get that in those kind of situations. once they were able to work through that, which look, I think if anybody said, they 100% worked through that last year to where everything was fine at the end of the season, I just don't know if that's the case because you still had some ups and downs along the way. But I do think he's a guy, he has a clean slate now, I think. And I think that's the most important thing going into the season. If we see the same kind of stuff maybe that happened last year, where he gets benched sometimes, he gets suspended sometimes, you're going to kind of feel, it's not going to feel good about maybe where things head. But if he comes into the year, he's kind of the player we saw that he could be, the year before. And even at times last year, he still wasn't a bad player last year. It's just there were some inconsistencies that you didn't see before. And I think it had to do with kind of butting heads, again, within maybe a new coaching staff, adjusting to new things that coaches want you to do, and that kind of thing. Maybe that's the situation, but I think he can be very good. And I want to bring up quickly, I didn't mention him earlier, Larry Austin, the Xavier transfer. Here's another guy that adds that depth to them, and he's going to be able to play a true point guard. Maybe LaChance gets more of a chance to pardon the pun, but gets more of a chance to move over to a shooting guard, have the opportunity to play, Austin, LaChance, Fisher Davis, Roberson, and then plug somebody else in there. You feel pretty good about that group. So they have a lot of options, and I think it all starts with Mashley Fisher Davis because if he's as good as he can be, they can be very, very good, I think.
Right. I think, again, if you watch Toye, you watch Brown, those are the two guys we need to watch. And if they take that next step, then I think Vanderbilt will be in the mix at least for an NCAA tournament bid. Well, that wraps up the team breakdowns tonight. We're just going to finish up real quick. I wanted to get Blake's thoughts on Player of the Year, Coach of the Year, maybe a newcomer. So, Blake, let's start off with Player of the Year. If you had to pick right now, who's your Player of the Year in the SEC?
Oh, my goodness, man. I've gone back and forth on this so many times. It's hilarious. I said a while ago that I said if the season started, and I think I said this in June, I said I'd go with Maton. I think I'm going to change that now. I think that, again, I'm going to change that today. If we do another one of these tomorrow, if we just want to re-record, I may give you a different answer. But I'm going to go with Michael Porter Jr. I know that's the safe pick, but I just don't think there's a player in the SEC that has that kind of skill set with what kind of the impact he's going to be able to make in getting Missouri into that top tier in the SEC. He's just so hard to guard, and I'm just going to go with him because he's going to be able to impact the game not only on the offensive end of the floor, on the defensive end of the floor as well. So I think I would go with him. And look, if you had to ask me, who's very close behind him, like I said earlier, I think it's Kevon Allen. I think it's Dante Maton. That would be the next two I would turn to, probably.
Right. I went with Kevon Allen. I think he's going to be able to put up enough production with that roster to win the award. I mean, we'll see what happens, but I would pick Allen. I think Michael Porter Jr. would obviously be in that mix. The thing that concerns me with Maton is, if Georgia really struggles, would they give him the award? And
that's where I went on that too. That's why I kind of lean towards changing it, is because, I could see Georgia finishing in a near, a very low spot if things don't go well, and then you're not going to get a player of the year out of it. So.
Absolutely. Okay, who are you going with for Coach of the Year in the SEC?
Oh man. I may just default back to the guy that I just, I told you, I just love this guy. I think he's someone that's because I could see this team winning the SEC outright, like we said. I mean, I think Mike White, to me, he won Coach of the Year last year. Like I said, I could see Florida being that team with the necessary weapons to challenge Kentucky at the top. I think Mike White's probably one. And look, I'll say this too, and this is an answer that may surprise some people, but look, if everything goes according to plan for Auburn and, they somehow wind up in the top 4 or 5 in the SEC, I think you have to throw Bruce Pearl in the mix there just because of how far maybe they've come as a program. And look, I know there will be jokes made about, all the investigation and that kind of stuff and, this and that, but hey, if they finish near there, he's a good candidate. And then obviously I think you look around and Avery Johnson's going to have Alabama. I'd go Mike White probably if you asked me today.
Well, there's obviously a lot of options. I'll say that.
Yeah.
I'm going to go with Billy Kennedy because I think Kennedy, with the season that A&M had last year, I think they're going to completely turn things around and probably finish in that top 3 at least if things go well. So I'd go with Billy Kennedy at Texas A&M. This might be your same pick for player of the year, but who's your newcomer of the year?
Well, that's just saying. I feel like I kind of ruined it by picking Michael Porter, but obviously you have to pick him. But, I'll go ahead and say this just to kind of make it interesting. I don't know. I think if you look around at all these different freshmen, obviously when you look at Kentucky's roster, there's a lot of guys that could be in that mix. And, just to kind of bring up some guys we didn't mention earlier, Quade Green, the point guard there, I think he's going to kind of fly under the radar and be a guy that maybe, if we look past Diallo, past Knox, who would probably be in that mix for newcomer of the year, obviously. He's a guy I think is very interesting too because, we know the point guard history with Calipari. We know he's always had guys that have put up great numbers at the point guard position. I think he's an interesting player too. But, yeah, I guess I have to go with Michael Porter Jr. So
Same here. You got to go with Porter Jr. also. I think Kevin Knox, though, could be in that mix as well for sure. So, all right. It's Sunday, October, 14th? Who's your champ on October 14th? Saturday. Sorry, Saturday.
Saturday, October the 14th. As I'm saying this now, and like I said, if anybody goes back and they watch this and then come Tuesday when I put my power rankings, they're like, well, Blake, you said this on Saturday. I'm like, well, I told you it could change. I'm going to be, I'm going to be lame, and I'm just going to say it's Kentucky because, look, the more I look at this roster, I just think there's so much talent there. And, again, if we're talking about, high ceiling, Kentucky has the highest ceiling of any team in the SEC if all that talent comes together. And like I said earlier, it seems like, I talked about how I am on Texas A&M. And I feel like I could definitely make the case for them, but I don't know why. Maybe it's just being ingrained in my head when we look back at the SEC. It's just like it's always Kentucky or Florida, no matter what. And it's like you always go back to those two teams. And like I said with Mike White, I'm just so impressed with what he's done. But, again, I'm going to be boring. I'm going to pick Kentucky today, but who knows?
I'm with you. I have to go with Kentucky as well, and I think they have all the pieces. I am a little concerned with the experience factor, but they have the best talent, from top to bottom. So I think you have to pick them right now to win the league. I'm sure the SEC media will pick them as well. So excellent time tonight, Blake. I really appreciate you for joining. Again, Blake has his website, southeasthoops.com. A lot of great stuff. Also, he is the Guinness Book of World Records holder for most podcasts ever recorded.
Maybe.
I don't even know the number, but it's up there. Definitely check it out, Marching to Madness. Blake, I really appreciate you joining. Thank you tonight.
Hey, you got it, man. Anytime.
All right, Blake. Thanks a lot. And we'll be back on Tuesday, everybody. We're going to do an ACC preview. Kevin Sweeney from cbbcentral.com will join me, and I'll post that as soon as we're done recording. Thanks a lot, and we'll talk to you later.